Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating paradox coming out of Australia. It's a story about schools that were specifically created to help some of the most vulnerable students, and the surprising discovery that, well, sometimes good intentions just aren't enough.
Let's start with just one number, 0.1%. Just let that sink in for a moment. What do you reckon that could possibly represent?
That's it. That's the percentage of all primary and secondary school leaders in Australia who are Indigenous. And, this isn't just a tiny number, it's a pretty profound statement about the lack of representation right at the top of the education system.
This chart here visualizes the core problem perfectly. See, while Australia is a really rich multicultural society, its education workforce is, well, it's overwhelmingly white and middle class. And this creates this huge cultural gap between the teachers and leaders and their diverse student body, especially their Indigenous students. This mismatch, it really sets the stage for some serious challenges.
So, to really understand the context here, we need to first have a look at Australia's well-documented education gap. The reality for a lot of Indigenous Australian students is pretty stark. They face these systemic disadvantages that show up as lower literacy and numeracy outcomes and way fewer students actually finishing their final year of high school. And the consequences of this, they go way beyond the classroom, contributing to poorer health outcomes and a shocking overrepresentation in the justice system. It's exactly this disparity that created the need for a totally different kind of school. And that brings us to a really innovative solution that's popped up to try and tackle this problem: the Flexi-School. So what on earth is a Flexi-School? Well, they're schools designed specifically for young people who've been pushed out of or have fallen through the cracks of mainstream education. Their goal is actually simple, but it's so powerful: to give these students a real chance to get back into formal, long-term learning in a way that actually works for them. And look, these aren't just a handful of niche schools either. This is a massive, growing sector. We're talking about more than 70,000 students every single year across Australia. Now, here's the really crucial bit. The reason researchers have focused so much on these schools is because they serve a disproportionately high number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So these schools, they're on the absolute front lines of Indigenous education, which makes their leadership practices incredibly important to get right. But when researchers looked a little closer at the leadership inside these really well-intentioned schools, they found something puzzling: a really surprising contradiction between what the leaders said they believed and what they were actually doing. And here is that paradox, right here. On the one hand, you had this incredible willingness. 7 out of the 8 school leaders in the study said they were actively trying to learn more about Indigenous cultures. But on the other hand, when you actually asked them for examples, their answers showed only a pretty surface-level understanding of what really supports and engages Indigenous learners. A massive disconnect. This quote from scholar Jill Blackmore, it really gets to the heart of why this disconnect might exist. It suggests that leadership often doesn't see schools as places where race and culture really matter. The whiteness of leadership is just treated as the default, the norm. And because it just goes completely unexamined, it can create these huge blind spots. So that brings us to the next big question: why were these good intentions falling so short? To find out, we've got to look at what these leaders were actually doing in their schools. When the researchers asked for examples of how they supported Indigenous students' cultural identities, the leaders kept pointing to activities like these: celebrating NAIDOC Week once a year, eating some traditional foods, or holding art and dance workshops. Now, don't get me wrong, these things are positive. Of course they are. But there's a real problem when they're the only things. And here's the critical perspective that explains the danger. Scholars Ladson Billings and Tate argue that when multiculturalism is just limited to food and festivals, it can actually become a form of covert racism. It gives a sense of tolerance, sure, but in doing so, it just reinforces the idea that Indigenous culture is other, something separate from the everyday norm of the school. So the crucial point is this: celebrating culture is not the same thing as actively dismantling racism. These kinds of surface-level activities, they totally fail to challenge the default white cultural norm of the school. And more importantly, they do absolutely nothing to address the deeper, systemic issues of racism that might exist in policies, in the curriculum, and in attitudes. Okay, so this leads us to the final and, I think, most important question: how do we fix this? How can leaders close this gap between their good intentions and their actual day-to-day practice? The solution really lies in a concept called praxis. Now, it might sound a bit academic, but praxis is simply the process of making sure your actions and your practices truly reflect your stated beliefs and values. It's about walking the talk.
And let's be really clear here, the study found that the problem was not a lack of care or commitment from these leaders. Not at all. The real challenge was in the execution. It's about moving from passively holding values like inclusion and social justice to actively embedding anti-racist practices into the very fabric of the school.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, the research suggests a pretty clear path forward. First, leaders have to stop pretending racism isn't a factor and just acknowledge that it's a structural issue. Second, they need to gain a much deeper understanding of how race and racism operate, going way beyond just cultural celebrations. And finally, they must constantly and critically reflect on whether their school's policies and actions are truly lining up with their stated values. And this brings us to our final thought. You know, while this study was focused on Australian schools, its lesson is pretty universal. It leaves us with a provocative question for all of us, really, in any workplace or organization. How do we make sure our stated values of inclusion, of equity, of respect are more than just words on a wall? How do we close our own practice gap? Thanks for joining me.